So he was arrested on July 6th of this year,
Yes.
which is about, roughly speaking, what 8 or 9 years after he had gotten out of prison the first time?
Right. It was almost 10 years. So we had been reporting on this case since 2014, which again is years after even the prison sentence. So when he finally got arrested, like 6 years after we started reporting on him, it was a huge shock and just the first of many shocks that would happen in this case.
Yeah, so I agree it's a shock. So that's why I wanted to start with July 6th is, what is your guys' theory as to why out of nowhere 10 years later he's arrested?
There's a lot of different theories in terms of like the fact that his usefulness might have been declining to some people. If you believe the theory that we've argued that he was an agent of the Mossad, there have been some changes in U.S.-Israeli relations over the last couple of years in terms of espionage. That might have made him, less of a valuable asset for the people that were protecting him. On the other hand, the SDNY, which was the group that finally went after him for this, I think they've traditionally operated a little bit outside of more like federal protocol in terms of who they're going after. They really seem to just want to go after the big fish, even if they're, an untouchable.
Southern District of New York, and famous for prosecuting white collar crimes in New York and so on, Michael Milken, et cetera.
So I think it's a little bit about them, having the balls to go after him. And then also, the part that we're still investigating is, how did the people that have been protecting him for so long, how did this happen that they finally decided that it wasn't worth it anymore?
Do you think the fact that it was the Trump administration changes anything? I mean, that's his U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York. The guy before him, I forget his name, is it Parit something, but he's a real anti-Trump. Yeah, he's a big anti-Trump guy. Right. Do you think that played into it?
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration is totally tied into this. As you know, if it had been Clinton, I probably would have been saying the same thing. Both of them are intricately entangled with Epstein. And we actually found in the book, this is super interesting, the night of the 2016 election, Jeffrey Epstein flew from Paris, where he'd been living, and his plane had been there for like months. He flew to Saudi Arabia on the eve of the election, stayed in Saudi Arabia up until almost like the moment that the election was called for Trump, and then flew back to Paris. So why did he feel like he needed to go hide out in Saudi Arabia pending the results of the election? Like, that's another kind of big red flag that we're looking into.
So your best theory today as to why this U.S. attorney in New York would have chosen to take on this case that was previously essentially, for all intents and purposes, dismissed by the U.S. attorney Acosta in Miami, is what?
I think one thing is declining usefulness of Epstein. Part of that is the rise of digital surveillance and apps and things. You don't need these on the ground spies anymore. But at the same time, you have to note there's been a huge cultural shift in terms of the believability of victims and how much weight that has as evidence. In the past, with his first arrest, there were 34 confirmed minors that spoke to the police about their experiences with him, and that wasn't enough to convict. That wasn't seen as solid evidence. But after the whole Me Too movement over the last couple of years, we've definitely seen a cultural shift in everyone's willingness to listen to victims and to believe them.
And are you pretty confident that he got off so lightly in Miami because he was an agent of Mossad, and that the word had come down from D.C. that, hey, hands off this guy?
Yeah, and I mean, Acosta said it himself that he had been told he was intelligence, but something a lot of people don't even know, which is in the book too, is the fact that before he got this big sweetheart deal that, gave him just a couple months in prison, he was actually offered another even better sweetheart deal by the government. He was offered a deal that would have seen him serve no prison time, that would have just put him on probation in his house in Palm Beach. And that he rejected the deal at the time because he still thought he was going to get away with it. Alan Dershowitz, who was his attorney at the time, said that he really believed he had a strong case he was going to walk free. But it's just it's ridiculous that people like Acosta and Trump are saying, this sweetheart deal, it was just the best we could do. We really wanted him to serve some prison time. It was so important. It's total BS, because a couple months before they gave him an even better deal. And the only reason he didn't take it is because he was hedging his bets.
So what is Acosta up to today?
We don't really know. He's kind of vanished from the radar. That's something that we're planning on going after for like our next book. The sequel is going down to Florida, find him, find his family. I'm sure he and the people around him definitely have some kind of a story to tell about what's gone down with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, if he got the directive from the Attorney General, which is, I think, what you guys are asserting, which is that Michael Mukasey?
I'm not sure who it was at the time. We're kind of asserting more like higher up even than that, like CIA.
Uh-huh. But anyway, bottom line is that it came from, it was, the AG was Michael Mukasey, which I think I got this from your book, actually,
okay.
Who is Jewish and very close to Israel. So there's a potential theory there that he has his own Israeli connections and therefore was aware of it and gave the word down. But anyway, point is that if Acosta got the directive from DC, he really took a bullet by resigning rather than giving that up.
Yeah, and we've started to see this with a lot of other people that have been kind of unceremoniously booted from Trump's inner circle, people that took a bullet for him and didn't get the same in return. So I think it's only a matter of time before we hear the truth from him.
Okay, so on July 6th, he's arrested. July 18th is when bail is denied, which was a pretty big deal, which is probably worth talking about a little bit. Epstein has got plenty of money, so he's hoping to be able to, during the pendency of the period before the trial, to be out on parole, essentially, and even suggested as much as $100 million bail, which was all rejected.
Just funny money, right?
Yeah.
So he, when he was waiting for the first conviction back in 2006, he actually waited out the whole investigation on his private Caribbean island, which is now known as Orgy Island or Little St. Jeff. I'm sure he was trying to plan to do the same thing. Obviously, the Virgin Islands, part of them are U.S. territory, so he could ostensibly go to his little oasis and just kind of hide out until the trial happened. But we spoke to, we had a reporter in the courtroom that day. We spoke to Gloria Allred, the famed victims' rights attorney, who was also in the courtroom that day. And everybody said that when he found out that he wasn't getting bail, he looked very confused. He looked very confused. He looked just totally wiped out, exhausted. Honestly, it was surprising to me. It was surprising to me that they held strong and kept him in prison.
Yeah, that's a tough judge because, at the end of the day, what he's accused of, let's be honest, I mean, it's not a terribly, terribly significant crime. I mean, he's basically alleged, the actual complaint involved how many underage girls was in the actual New York complaint? I forget, just a handful.
It's just a handful, yeah.
Yeah, from 15 years prior.
And they're adults now.
So it's it's statutory rape essentially, right? I forget if that complaint actually accused him of being of essentially pimping the girls out or operating a sex ring. It was really just him indulging, right?
Right.
So this isn't the most major federal crime that we've come across.
They, of course, even if it was one person, that's significant. But this, as far as in context of his greater crimes, it was just the very tip of the iceberg. What really influenced the decision was the fact that the federal agents, when they were raiding his New York mansion, found this fake passport, which was an Austrian passport that listed his residence as Saudi Arabia. Like, why in the world did he have that? And his attorneys came out and said, well, they had this convoluted story, a friend of his gave it to him and he was afraid that because he's Jewish, somebody in the Middle East might try to kidnap him. And it's like, you just start laughing halfway through it. But that was enough to convince them that he was a flight risk. He had resources that they didn't even know about. But I mean, judges try not to take in that external information, that context, but I feel like that had to have played a part in the decision, the fact they knew what everything else that he had done.
Yeah, well, that judge deserves a lot of credit for doing that. But yeah, bottom line is you got a guy with a fake passport, a ton of money, in his own private plane that he flies all over the world. And so talk about flight risk. Your comment about him being shocked by that ruling is interesting, because if he committed suicide, we have to kind of walk through the spiral down that he experienced, that being step one. Because one of the big questions in my mind was, wait a minute, this guy can afford to hire the dream team. He can afford OJ's team times 10. And in fact, he did hire the OJ's team times 10 in Miami, and it was very successful. So he should have had every reason to believe that there was a good chance of him beating this, or negotiating something very insignificant like he did in Miami. So, why did he apparently at some point become hopeless, if you believe in the suicide route, which I do. So I need to defend that. But there is a spiraling down that you see that starts with that denial, correct?
I think the world was kind of narrowing in a little bit. But everything that we've heard from inside the jail, including, we spoke to an attorney that was with him, I believe, that 1 day or 2 days before the suicide attempt. This was an old friend that had come to visit. Everybody said that he, delusionally or not, he still seemed to be willing to fight this. He would hole up in the kind of attorney conference room at the prison for the whole day, days at a time, with his team. And this attorney that we spoke to, who saw him just before the suicide, said he did seem like he was in good spirits, and he was talking about, future plans and things like that. Obviously, nobody really knows unless you were there. But certainly, it's his whole entire life, he had this attitude that he was always going to slip out of it, no matter what happened. Even in the early days before the pedophilia and the sex ring came to be, he slipped out of so many sticky situations on Wall Street and issues with securities fraud and things like that. That was his, if anything defined his life, it was that he could get out of any scrape. But starting with the bail, like you said, if you believe in the suicide verdict, there certainly were things that were happening that were, they had to have conveyed to him that this was going to be different, that one thing at a time, whether it was having his house raided, the passport discovered, seeing these women, his victims, finally standing up and speaking out en masse like that. All of these things had to have had some effect on his ability to believe that anymore.
What about meds? This kind of ties into one of my theories. Are we aware whether he was on any type of meds?
We're not. We had a source inside the prison that was on the same cell block as him, but he didn't know anything about that. I haven't heard that from anybody.
I don't know what happens when you go to prison if you are on meds. Now, it's very possible a guy like him, if he was on some type of meds, I'm talking about for some psychiatric condition, bipolar, you name it. It's very possible that he was getting them kind of off prescription anyway. Right. But, if you're in prison and you are taking prescription medications, I would imagine they permit you to continue those, but I don't know that for sure. Yeah,
I haven't. I would believe that also, but I've seen a lot of the prison records from when he was in Florida. I didn't see anything kind of about that. And then there's been much less that's come out of the New York prison situation since the investigation is still ongoing. But I haven't, in all of the stuff that I've seen or talked to people about, I haven't seen anything like that. And, when the police went through his trash for weeks at a time down in Palm Beach, all of that's in the official record, and you can see everything that they found, every scrap of paper. Nothing about prescriptions or doctor visits, anything like that in those documents.
Interesting. Well, he certainly seems to be at minimum a sociopath. So he has presumably some type of psychiatric condition. And that's why I wonder if he had been taking meds and then he's off his meds, that could help explain, getting unbalanced in the suicide.
change in mindset.
So let's talk about, so then July 23rd, 5 days after bail is denied is when he attempts suicide, allegedly.
Mm-hmm.
What is your guys' view? Was that in fact a suicide attempt on that day?
Yeah, so my co-author, James Robertson, he was actually one of the first people that reported that on Radar Online. They got a tip from inside the prison and were able to confirm it with some people close to Epstein. So we've been really on top of that from the beginning. We found, like I told you, somebody that actually witnessed it. Kind of more the aftermath, though. They didn't really see the actual scuffle. I'm personally on the murder side of things. So I know we're gonna like battle it out right now.
You just announced yourself.
I'm wearing an Epstein didn't kill himself shirt.
It's like a birther. It's like a birther. We'll have to come up with a name for you guys. Okay. Yeah. Well, so all right. So you're on the murder side, but yeah. as for that event, where are you on that one?
What we know for sure is that he did have markings on his neck. He was involved in some kind of incident. He was definitely out cold when this happened. The person that witnessed it said when he saw them taking him out, his feet and his face were blue. Something happened in there. If you lean towards the murder side, like me, I think that someone could have entered his cell. If it was suicide, it definitely could have been a suicide attempt. But regardless, I think somebody, whether it was suicide or murder, someone was involved that wanted it to happen that wasn't necessarily Epstein. The fact that we just found out yesterday that the tapes of outside his cell from that night have suddenly disappeared, in the same way of the suicide, there's just too many things that raise questions. If it was a simple suicide attempt, they would have kept the tapes.
Right.
Because it would have exonerated them, right?
Yeah, coincidentally, this just came out yesterday as I was reading your book, and then I saw this thing come up where the videotape of his cell, which apparently they had before, and I believe people had watched it, so wouldn't we have heard if that videotape showed something other than an attempted suicide? Forget about where it's gone now.
Yeah.
Up until now, the understanding has been that videotape showed that it was a suicide.
Mm-hmm. I don't know of anyone in particular that ever saw it. And, the fact that it's missing now, I'm sure there's not one person on earth that didn't roll their eyes when they heard that.
It could go on missing very soon, but that's a report as of yesterday that it wasn't. Some prosecutor said, I'm not aware of where it is right now, so I don't know how much that's been blown out. But my understanding is his cellmate, which was a former cop,
mm-hmm.
he's upset. He wants that tape out there to prove his innocence, because he's basically saying, "Hey, I'm the one that called for help."
Yeah.
How much time was it between the time that Epstein would have theoretically either been the attempted murder or the attempted suicide, and him and the cellmate calling for help? Do you know?
It was just moments. That's the witness told us that he heard some kind of a scuffle, and the guards in that case actually they weren't asleep that time. They actually made it over to the cell pretty quickly.
And the witness that you guys were the ones that interviewed, mm-hmm. he's the one that says that he thinks it was a suicide. He has no reason to believe it was the cop.
No, he does actually think that the guards were somehow involved, that it was more of an attack or a murder. He says that in the weeks leading up to this, the way that the guards treated Epstein was really kind of out of the norm. Obviously, they don't make best friends with people that are in the prison, but he said the way that they treated him was just like a whole other level of disgust and disdain. And he thinks that they had something to do with it, that they either allowed somebody else to let this happen or actively participated in that.
Okay. Well, I just read the book yesterday, as I thought for sure that you guys in the book, maybe someone else was responsible for that part, was saying that the witness had no reason to believe, certainly not that the cop did it.
No, I mean, he certainly didn't see anybody like enter the cell. I mean, he's on the same block, so he didn't see like a person dressed in black walk down the hallway and go into his room.
And by the way, we've got cameras all throughout that prison.
Yeah.
Granted, some of them perhaps don't work, as we've learned, but you got a bunch of others. So you're going to see somebody walking around.
Yeah.
And you're also going to have some evidence, you would think. Usually,
Right.
when there's a crime committed that involves another party, you've got fingerprints and this and that. So we really have no evidence that this was an attempted murder. We have speculation and saying that, oh, gee, guards didn't like him, and oh, gee, this seems weird to me that he would attempt suicide. You have speculation like that, but as far as evidence, really none.
No, and no eyewitness details. It's more like, this is Dylan's perspective, that he was allowed to commit suicide, that, they looked the other way for reasons, and it might have been as simple as they didn't like him. But at the end of the day, it is Occam's razor, the simplest explanation, that he did commit suicide. So
attempted, anyway.
Yeah,
right.
and later successful.
Yeah. So in that one, I think it's the second one. It seems like it's easier to argue for an attempted murder because you don't have the cameras and you got the sleeping guards. Whereas on the first one, you've got guards responding right away. You've got the witness. You got the guy in the cell. But the problem is, for murder theorists, it's that if he attempted suicide the first time, that makes it all the more likely that, in fact, the second one was suicide. Because now you're talking about a real coincidence that, okay, he tried to kill himself the first time and then was murdered the second time. I mean, it's getting a little out there for you guys on the
longer string.
Yeah.
But like I said, even among the three of us that wrote the book together, we have kind of different views on it. So.
Okay, so then the next event that I've got is he goes into suicide watch, and comes off of it only 6 days later, if I've got my dates correct. 23rd is the suicide attempt, and then he goes on suicide watch, and they take him off on the 29th. But when you're on suicide watch, that sounds to me like very unpleasant. You're in a cell by yourself, and it's extremely bare what they allow to be in there. And I think you guys even talk in the book about this prison being rat infested, etc. And that section of the suicide watch area is really a place you don't want to be, and that really dragged Epstein down. But talk about that.
Right. So this, as if prison could get any worse, it does in this kind of suicide watch area. Like you said, the cells are extremely bare. The sheets that they give them are essentially like paper towels, because they would just rip if you tried to hang yourself. So everything that we've heard from inside the prison and people close to Epstein was that he and his legal team were involved in getting him off on suicide watch because, like you said, it was so difficult for him to bear, especially from where he's come from in his life. So that part doesn't necessarily seem nefarious, like that the guards were actively trying to get him back into the general population. I think everything points to his team just, him saying, I can't deal with this, like, get me out of here, So,
well, and there could be a general indifference to suicide in that prison, as far as you guys make a number of points, a lot of evidence that the guards disliked him. Probably because he's an alleged pedophile. Also, he was trying to curry favor with other prisoners, etc. So somehow he got on the shit list of the guards. And presumably they don't care if he kills himself or not. They probably were celebrating his suicide or alleged suicide, just as frankly I did. I'm kind of a different view than some, as far as being so upset that we're not going to have a day in court and so on. And who am I to speak on that? I mean, it's the victim's day in court, but if I look back in the OJ case, OJ attempted suicide, or was suicidal at least. I wish he had committed suicide instead of subjecting everybody to what we got to be subjected to. And there was no guarantee we were going to convict Epstein, because he was going to have the dream team times 10. So the fact that he's dead, in my opinion, is a good thing. I celebrate that. So, and I think it's very possible the prison guards felt the same way.
Yeah, completely. I feel the same way too. I don't think that there was any guarantee that he was going to suddenly reveal all of his powerful co-conspirators across the world. Like, that's not him at all. But yeah, even if the guards weren't actively involved in giving him a noose or letting in a killer or something like that, they didn't like him. The rest of the prisoners didn't really like him. They were sick of having his team come in there, take up the conference room all day long. They just rolled their eyes at it. Here's this billionaire padding around in his slippers and having his lawyers come in every day and take up the room that other people want to use. And, you know, there was definitely, like I said, more, if they don't like the prisoners in general, this was like a higher degree of it for so many reasons, like you mentioned.
And then talking about the spiraling down, I think you guys wrote that when he was in the suicide watch, he was found like sleeping on the floor and just kind of exhibiting strange behavior.
Yeah. And that kind of like started at the bail hearing. Like that was the first time anyone saw him kind of looking dazed and confused, not in control of the situation. And
that's, if I got my dates correct. So 29th, he's taken off a suicide watch. And then on the 31st, there was a hearing where many people reported him looking totally out of it.
Yeah, that whole period, he was just acting like definitely a different person and looking like it too. You know, he's always been very like assured of himself and kind of, he used to smirk in the face of justice. You know, when he had those depositions back in the early 2000s, he was laughing at the prosecutors. But certainly in that time period that you're talking about, the spiral, he totally transformed, at least externally. So you can only imagine what was happening to him internally at that time.
So on the that's on the 31st that he looks totally out of it, and then on the 8th he updates his will. What do we know about that?
So he updates his will, puts everything into a trust, puts his brother as kind of the head of the trust. This protects the money from any of the victims kind of doing civil cases against him. But what's also super interesting is that the attorneys that are the trustees of this will, they have a really long history with Epstein that goes back to the 90s when he was involved in a major Ponzi scheme with Towers Financial Group that was exposed. His partner went to prison for 25 years and Epstein got off. These two guys were the investigators of that investigation that let Epstein get off at that point. So ever since then, they've been really closely tied together, and he actually ended up making them the executors of his will, along with another guy who, I forget his name off the top of my head. It's something really unusual. He's connected to Microsoft and Bill Gates and worked with Bill Gates for a really long time. He was added as a backup executor. And this guy came out afterwards and was like, I have no idea why he put me on this document. I didn't even barely know the guy. I don't want this. Take me off this document. But that raises another question that we talk about in the book in terms of his connections with Bill Gates and who he actually wanted to get this money. His brother now is kind of the head of it. And, you know, it's so strange. We haven't heard that much from his brother throughout the years, despite all this. He has money himself, but he's started to come out a little bit more now in terms of claiming that it was a murder thing. And we don't even know, like, did he have a major insurance policy that would let his family get more money if it was murder versus suicide? Like, that's another possibility that we're still trying to figure out. But again, like you were saying, is it a coincidence that the day before he gets suicided or commits suicide, that he changed his will like that? You know, it certainly would be a huge coincidence that the timing worked out.
Right. So yeah, the brother hires Michael Baden to stand in at the autopsy.
Right.
Right. And Baden, who we know from the OJ case.
Yes.
So willing to do work for OJ and for Epstein. And the original coroner's report said that it was suicide, even though it acknowledged that some of the one or more of the bones that broke in his neck was not always consistent with suicide, could be more consistent with homicide. It seems like Baden really took that and ran with it and saw the same things and said, that tells me suicide.
Yeah.
I mean homicide. I'm concluding homicide.
Yeah. So autopsies and death reports, it's really tricky because no matter how great the medical examiner is, it's always an opinion. Like, they're taking these pieces of evidence and basically saying what they think happened based on that. So from person to person, even in cases that are not as contentious as this, you're going to have differences of opinion. And what was really like kind of added to the mystery surrounding that, though, was that the medical examiners in New York did not release a copy of the autopsy to the family before they announced the results of it. And that's actually really unusual. Baden and other sources close to the family at the time told us that like they were having a really hard time getting the actual documents and the report from the autopsy. So that added a little bit to the suspicion, I think, like why in this one case did they not, make the records public? Were they trying to hide information from the family? That kind of, adds fuel to the fire in terms of the other argument. But it could have also just been that they wanted to get the results out to the public in terms of the death report, since it was a case of like huge interest.
And what public statements has the brother made about the death and about his belief that he was murdered as opposed to suicide?
Mm-hmm. He came out pretty recently and did an interview. I forget the outlet, but he did a short interview and basically said he does not believe that his brother would have committed suicide, that it was entirely out of character for him, that they want more of an investigation into what actually happened. I don't really know that that's true, that they want a deeper investigation into his brother's life on the public scale. You have to ask why he, after decades of not commenting on his brother, why suddenly now is he coming out and, pushing the narrative that he was murdered? Again, like I said, maybe it's an insurance thing. Maybe there's like a deeper play happening here. He wants to cover up the suicide or something like that. But it's really weird to first hear from him in all of these cases now after the brother has died.
Mm. So if you're on the murder side of things, you have to at least piece together a plausible narrative as to how this occurred without leaving any trace of evidence behind, essentially. So walk us through what your potential theory would be as to how he was murdered on that day, as opposed to...
It's a tall order. Maybe it's a little bit more murder agnostic. I think there's still more information that we need. But I do think that it would have been possible for somebody to enter the prison on that night, given the fact that the guards were asleep, the tapes are destroyed. If there was any other kind of evidence in the prison, I'm sure it would have been destroyed just like the tapes have been. The way that he was found strangled, whether that was by suicide or someone else, like you mentioned, a lot of the physical things that came out in the autopsy can also point to more towards strangulation. So he broke the hyoid bone in his neck. He had eye hemorrhages. Both of those things can be from a suicide, but not usually suicides from such a low angle as he was. So he supposedly hung himself off his bed by leaning forward. The impact and force of that kind of a hanging doesn't usually produce the serious results that they found in the autopsy.
Attorney General Barr has ordered an investigation into the whole thing, right? I don't know.
Right.
Part of it, of course, is we know that the guards are being charged with falsifying reports. Mm-hmm. You guys also make a good point in the book about how one guard apparently had worked an 80-hour shift that week, and the other was picking up extra shifts. So this idea that they fell asleep is kind of believable, considering the hours they had been working, and considering I always say you can't overestimate the incompetence of federal employees, especially out of prisons. And the time that they were sleeping was essentially 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So not the easiest time to stay awake, especially in you're supposed to be watching Epstein, but if they don't really care about Epstein, he's in a cell, and if he ends up killing himself, we don't care.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that we don't really know what happens every day in prisons. Maybe they're sleeping every night and we don't know that. But I'm super skeptical about the Barr investigation. I question a lot, why haven't these guards come forward at all? These are minimum wage employees, and the type of people that in other cases usually run to outlets like the New York Post or the National Enquirer to talk about what actually happened. It's really strange to me that somehow they've managed to kind of push these people below the radar and, put a lid on the whole thing in terms of federal witnesses. So that's really weird that that's happening. The destroyed evidence, obviously this is more on the conspiracy side, but Bill Barr has long connections to Epstein. His dad was a part of the team that hired Epstein at the Dalton School way back in the 70s. So, you know, that's something that conspiracists pick up on a lot. But personally, I think the whole, like, we're going to do an investigation press conference was just all for show. And I think they're hoping that it's just going to die over, which in some ways it is. You know, as this gets older and older, there's fewer and fewer people that are putting it on the front page. Just people like you and me that are still trying to figure out what happened.
Yeah. Well, we'll put a wager down on it, you and I. We'll figure out what that is and see what we ultimately conclude, although I'm sure it's never going to be settled.
You know, I just want a good story. That's, you know.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Maybe he's not really even dead. Maybe he's, you know, on an island somewhere.
So the other, the major thing you guys assert is that he, in fact, was running a blackmail scheme, presumably for Mossad, that he connected with Ghislaine, is that how you pronounce it?
It's a hard G, Ghislaine.
Ghislaine.
Yeah.
That he meets Ghislaine through her. He meets her father, Robert Maxwell, who, you know, we've interviewed Dylan on the show, who says that he absolutely was Mossad, and that connects Epstein into that world, right? And that's all in the book, and I highly recommend people check out the book. One question I had is, if he was running a blackmail scheme and all the evidence that's been collected, has there been evidence that he was running a blackmail scheme? And for instance, you know, video of famous, powerful men with girls.
Certainly, yeah. We, starting with, like, in terms of setting up the scene, we've personally seen evidence that he's rigged all his homes for this. So one, in Palm Beach, it's all in the police report from the first raid that he had cameras hidden throughout that property in, like, clocks or, like, in a desk facing out to the rim. Like, his whole home there was rigged with this hidden surveillance system. And the central computer that housed all that was missing when they did the raid. So then in New York, most people haven't even seen inside of that property. In terms of journalists, I don't think anybody has, unless they were, you know, like, invited to George Stephanopoulos, invited to dinner. But I've seen hundreds of photos from inside that house, and he had a room there that was rigged with, like, 8 monitors showing surveillance from all over the property. And maybe that's not too strange for somebody that's really rich and has a big home. But what was really strange is that he had a massive professional grade printer, large format printer, hooked up to the surveillance system, and a couple of other smaller ones hooked up to that. So I've never seen anybody that had, like, a typical surveillance camera with a little guard there having this whole other piece to, like, print out records of what they see on there. And then we know that when the FBI raided that home, they found thousands of photos, some of which they said were sexually suggestive. So there's
I wanted to ask you specifically about what was found as far as photos, because I read these reports, and included in your book, that photos of underage girls were found, promiscuous photos, etc. But was anything found with a guy in the picture, as far as we know?
So there's this guy we mentioned in the book, John Mark Dugan, who was a sheriff's deputy in Palm Beach when that investigation was going on. And he says that he obtained the actual blackmail files that were recovered in that investigation, that he took those, and he's now living in Russia. So he says,
yeah, well, for sure, he's on my list of things I wanted to cover with you, because that's one of the really interesting side stories that I was not aware of. That is pretty amazing. So let's talk about that, but just finish though with what was found in New York. Of what was found in New York, all these pictures, thousands of pictures, or whatever it was. Do we have any reason to believe that any of that? Have we heard any reports that it involved pictures of girls with men?
Yeah. There have been reports that there were men with the girls. Nobody's been named. They haven't said Prince Andrew was in one of those sexual photos. There are photos of these famous men without young girls all over Epstein's house in really intimate situations. You know, Andrew, Ehud Barak, President Clinton. I've seen personal photos of them all throughout that property. They haven't been identified in, like, the X-rated images yet, but they certainly have said that there were men in the pictures. And then as far as Dugan, he showed some of the video that he claims to have to another journalist, Ron Chepeziuk, and he says that he saw an older man with a younger woman, like in a bedroom in a sexual situation that he didn't necessarily recognize.
Okay, let's tell this guy's story. It's John Mark Dugan.
Yes.
Okay, so and he was the Palm Beach County Sheriff.
Yes, he was a deputy sheriff in Palm Beach.
A deputy sheriff. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how is it that he winds up with these materials, which we're saying are pictures and video that are potential blackmail materials?
Right.
How is it that he winds up with them as an individual, as opposed to them being the property of the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department?
Right. So first of all, just in general, there was a lot of weird stuff that happened with the evidence in Palm Beach. Like, we were fighting them for almost a decade to get anything out of them. And they told us all these stories. Oh, the records were in a place that flooded. Oh, we lost them. Some of them got destroyed. And when we moved, blah, blah, blah. Like, there's a lot going on there. But these documents were obtained in the beginning from a detective named Joseph Ricari, who was with the Palm Beach police. So they handled the whole investigation, not the sheriffs. Where the sheriffs got involved was when Epstein went to prison. They were charged with kind of his whole prison situation, his work release, staying on top of that.
And we're talking about the difference between city and county. You're saying Palm Beach Police, Palm Beach City, and then it's the Sheriff's Department that's for the county.
Yeah, so they basically like handed the case on. And he says that he was really close with Ricari, that Ricari, as the leader in the investigation, when he was kind of handing the case over to the sheriffs, gave the documents or copies of the documents to Dugan and said, like, hey, here's what you're dealing with. Here's all the case info. Here's what you need to know. And that's how he obtained the documents and came to know of them.
Okay, so probably they're copies. They're not originals, or they're electronic. So he doesn't have the only copy of this. They also theoretically
many copies by this point.
Okay, but still, it's given to him in his capacity as a deputy at the Sheriff's Department.
And that would be total normal protocol, right?
Okay. Okay, so what happens next?
I've seen the police reports where they list all the DVDs that they got, and you know, there certainly was a lot of digital and VHS in the 90s material.
Okay. So, all right, so what happens with John Mark Dugan next? So he gets these materials. Epstein is in a county jail, right? And what happens next with Dugan?
So nothing really happens when Epstein's in the prison. He kind of oversees it. He says that it was, you know, irregular that Epstein got to leave and stuff, but he was still, you know, towing the line, right? But then over time, Dugan starts to witness, he says, corruption inside the Palm Beach Sheriff's Department, inside the Palm Beach Police Department, that there are things that are happening, you know, including the treatment of Epstein, that he doesn't necessarily agree with. So he starts to be more vocal about what he claims he's seeing in the police department. He's posting blogs online accusing the police officers and his higher ups in the sheriff's department of doing crazy things, going to the Caribbean for sex orgies, Nazism, like just basic, you know, corruption within the department, human resources corruption.
All stuff pertaining to Epstein, or not necessarily?
No. Just in general. He basically starts becoming like a vigilante and saying like, hey, this whole department is, you know, rotten to the core, and it's not just Epstein, that there's all this other stuff going on. So he becomes more and more public about that. Obviously, they don't appreciate that. And then shortly after that period of him being more active online, his home was raided by the authorities. They said it had to do, I think, with like a sexual harassment claim at the office. I'm not positive, I forget that detail, but his home was raided. He freaks out and he's like, "What? I'm a target now. Why am I a target?" He flees to Russia, gets political asylum in Russia, which...
But he felt he was a target of whom?
Of the government, of the U.S. government.
Okay, not of the Israeli government or Mossad? Okay.
No, he thought that like he's speaking out too much. He's becoming a target within the United States, and the FBI and the CIA, they're like, what do you actually know? And it's getting too hot for him, essentially. So he flees to Russia.
Okay, so a guy from Palm Beach.
His wife and kids.
A guy from Palm Beach who's in the sheriff's department in Palm Beach, Florida, abandons his family to quote unquote flee to, of all places, Russia.
Right. And
I mean, that is just bizarre.
Open arms. They say, you know, come on in, you get political asylum, like no problem. Very highly unusual for the average American police officer.
But again, did
Yeah.
he feel he was getting heat in Palm Beach as a result of him blowing the whistle and all kinds of improprieties going on in that office? Not necessarily Epstein related stuff.
Including the Epstein stuff. And the main thing that, frightened him or made him feel like he had to flee was that when the house was raided, whether that was because of Epstein or the other stuff, they started going through his files and they took, things that he had at his house, and he didn't want them to get the Epstein blackmail files back.
So he had taken the Epstein blackmail files to his house.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that doesn't seem appropriate?
I know. I don't think so either. But he felt like, it's too much corruption going on. I got to protect these. Took him to his house, he says, and then, in further efforts to protect the documents, fled to Russia. And he says it was worth it to leave his family and his kids, and he hasn't seen them for like at least 6 years. He says it was worth it because he's protecting the truth, essentially. He doesn't want this to get covered up. And he says that he's going to be speaking out more and more about this and potentially showing the videos more and more over time. He certainly has in the last couple of months.
What else has he been doing for the past 6 years?
He's very active on his blog. I don't actually know what his business is in Russia, but he posts a lot online.
That is just
really
really
well there. Like he posts a lot of videos where he's riding around in really nice cars and Range Rovers and nice apartments. So
and how high up in the Russian government do we think it goes as far as providing this? I don't know if you really would call it asylum because he hasn't been charged with anything, right? So he's really not avoiding the law per se. It's kind of hard to figure out what exactly he's doing, why he's in Russia. But presumably, you got to have an extended visa to be able to stay there that long, whatever the heck is required in Russia. So how high up do we think this goes in the Russian government? I
think it goes up to Putin. I mean, the KGB certainly is involved in all of the Epstein stuff, and Putin, as former head of the KGB, is always intricately involved with everything that they're doing. I'm sure it's not like his number one priority or the main thing that he's focusing on right now, but I'm sure that he knows about it and that he was involved in it. And it is like, if it is true that he has these tapes of Prince Andrew and other, really powerful people around the world, of course, that's a huge asset for Russia and their own, activities right now to have within their borders. So maybe
what does he assert that he has? Has he been specific as far as what men are in the videos, for instance?
He hasn't named any of the men yet. He says that he has a hard drive or something with all these videos and photos on it, and that there are surveillance videos taken from a corner overlooking a bed or something like that, or different positions in different rooms that show older men having sex and doing sexual acts with younger women. So he hasn't specifically said Prince Andrew is on this tape, but he said that he believes he's being targeted now by the MI6 because they think that Andrew's on the tapes.
Okay, I don't want to. We could talk all day, so I want to get to a couple other things before I let you go. So we'll do maybe kind of a little bit of lightning round. But the other fascinating thing that came out that I wasn't aware of is this guy Al Seckel, who was the husband of Isabel Maxwell, sister to Ghislaine Maxwell, and a scientist. Just tell us that story real quick in a minute or two, and then I'll ask you a couple questions about it.
Yeah, so I found a woman when we started the book and the podcast who is close friends with Isabel Maxwell. And she said to me, hey, you need to look into the fact that Isabel, her husband, Al Seckel, and Epstein hosted a big scientist conference on Little St. James. And this conference was part of Epstein's efforts after prison to seem like more of a respectable member of society. So Seckel's involved with this, close with Epstein. Seckel announces that he's trying to sell some of Robert Maxwell's papers. Seckel turns up dead. He vanishes out of nowhere, and then his body's found at the bottom of a ravine. His car's totally separated from
somewhere in Europe, right?
Yeah, and in France. They said he was cave hunt, like exploring caves in France, and he vanished.
And he also has a major car crash just before that, after the conference.
Yeah. And what's absurd to me is like nobody ever talks about this. Like when she said, you know, Isabel Maxwell's husband died in really strange circumstances, I was like, that's really interesting. You know,
well, her father, as people know, what died in very strange circumstances, where we still don't know whether it was accident, suicide, or murder, out off of his yacht. And then here, his son-in-law, as just as mysterious disappearance and ultimately death, because the body's found like 5 days later or something.
Yeah. I mean, it was a really long time before they even found the body. And Isabel claimed that she had no idea that like he was even going hiking, and they had no clue where he was until the French authorities found him like a week later. But it's a weird coincidence that all of like the men connected to these Maxwell women are just kind of dropping off. Like,
and what evidence? What's our evidence that he was trying to sell Robert Maxwell documents?
There was an interview with Seckel that actually came out like the week after he died. So it had been completed a couple months before he died. And in that interview, he told the magazine doing the interview that he had this, you know, cache of documents that were Robert Maxwell's, and he was looking to sell them. So that was like a huge red flag to me when I read that, because if Maxwell was ostensibly working for Mossad, they would not want this random guy to be going through all of his correspondence and selling it to the highest bidder. So, you know, could that be connected? Possibly.
So one of the things that's really kind of stunning when I read the book is I didn't realize how many people still received Epstein after he had served a prison term for, essentially statutory rape and dealing with underage girls. And anybody who did any scratching of the surface would know that there was far more to it than what he actually served time for. But people as prominent as Bill Gates were having numerous interactions with him. According to your book, Gates met with him 5 or 6 times after he got out of prison over the years.
Yeah, and he bragged about it. He emailed his, coworkers afterwards saying like what a great night it was at Jeffrey Epstein's house. So it's the most shocking example of it is Epstein actually hosted a kind of like, hey guys, I'm out of prison party in New York. His first return to the New York social scene. And the guest list for that was just a bunch of A-listers that you never expect to associate with him. Katie Couric, George Stephanopoulos, Harvey Weinstein, Chelsea Handler was even there. And these people had
well, the Harvey Weinstein part, not so much of a surprise, but yes, the other ones, Charlie Rose, I'm going from the list from your book, Woody Allen. But there was a question.
Woody Allen.
but there was a question you guys raised in the book, and that was whether or not these guests understood that this was a party celebrating him getting out of jail, because I think you guys say that his home, this unbelievable, most expensive mansion in New York, while he was in prison, was actually rented out for some parties.
Yeah, so people like Katie Couric and Chelsea Handler said that they came because they didn't even really know who he was. It was just more like, hey, this is going to be an elaborate party with the elite of New York. It's really exclusive. Come check it out. It'll be like a fun little weird bucket list kind of thing. But it just begs further discussion that in 2010, like maybe it wasn't the full on Twitter culture as it is now, but there was the internet, and I don't know, people had to have known about this. It wasn't like he was just operating in Palm Beach. He was friends with the Clintons then. Like, how did George Stephanopoulos not know who he was, right?
What about Woody Allen? Is there any other connections other than this party between Woody Allen and him?
No record of any connections besides the fact that they were kind of neighbors. They lived really close together on the same street, which also in close proximity was home to Bill Cosby. So not the best place to be if you're a young girl in New York City. We're calling it pedophile row for a little.
Right. What about just ticking through a couple of the other names that are associated with him that would seem to be sweating a little bit, or maybe sweating less now that he's dead? But Bill Clinton seems to be kind of at the top of that list.
Right.
As you sit here today, based on everything that you've reviewed, et cetera, what's your best guess as to whether or not Clinton himself indulged in underage women via Epstein?
I mean, I'm positive he indulged, even if that was just like looking at them and enjoying them parading around in their tight little clothes, I'm a huge Democrat and liberal, and I met Clinton, but everything about him, like that would be that's totally par for the course for him to be hanging out with young, hot women all the time. And the fact that he deliberately took a lot of these flights without his Secret Service agents, which is not common, makes it clear that this was more of like a personal relationship for him, and that he was doing things that he didn't necessarily want them to see. Do I think that he was involved in an orgy in the Caribbean, like some of the victims have claimed? Not necessarily, but like for sure he was on the plane with women. For sure he got some kind of a rise out of the situation, whether it was just the novelty of being in the jet with these women. There was definitely, it wasn't all business, for sure.
Well, and by the way, I think it's important to remind people that not all the women were underage, that in fact, it seems like it was a minority of the girls entered, albeit they're young, they're 18, 19, 20, but it seems like the majority of them were actually of age.
Yeah, so that's one thing that his brother has been talking about a lot more recently, is that after he went to prison, most of the women, I think pretty much all the women that we know about that were around him were of age. That, like you said, they were really young. And it was only before the prison stint that he had these 16, 15, 14-year-olds. So what we heard from a lot of people that were around him in the Palm Beach years and later was that like they just didn't know how old the girls were. Like they assumed that they were in their 20s because they looked older, and that can certainly happen with younger women, but like nobody was asking for IDs.
Last one I want to ask you about is Alan Dershowitz. You guys interviewed him for the book, right?
Yes.
Were you the person interviewing him, or huh?
No, it was reporter Jen Hager, who I've worked with for a really long time. She's great. Okay.
So you've never directly interviewed Dershowitz about this?
No, I personally have not spoken with him. But
so he comes out whenever you see him, he's been very out front on this, and very defensive of his involvement, and he articulates a very, very strong case in his favor, because he's a great lawyer, to say that, hey, I absolutely did not indulge. But one of the women in particular, formerly a girl, alleges that he did participate, right?
Right. So Virginia Roberts Giuffre said in her civil case back in 2014 that he did rape her as part of her quote unquote work with Jeffrey Epstein. So we've been in communication with him about this since 2014, 2015, and he's been very adamant, like you said, that it's all lies. So I take him at his word. I don't want to get sued.
Well, I mean, it's his word against hers.
Yeah.
So one of the two of them is lying. So, then you look to motivation, and you're like, well, obviously he's got reason to lie. So then you go to her and say, well, what would be her reason to make that up? And if she is making that up, then it calls into question everything else that she's asserting.
It's such a tough spot, because especially where we are now culturally, like, believe victims, right? Like, if they say it, it's true. But he says that he has, tons of documentation about this, that he wants like the cases to move forward, so he has the opportunity to defend himself. He says that even in his kind of more friendship years with Epstein, that he never saw anything untoward.
I think he might admit, I read his deposition testimony where he's asked about this. And I know that one of his points is that she did not want to name him in a lawsuit. And the attorney was kind of making the point that, okay, that doesn't mean that she's saying it didn't happen. There could be a variety of reasons why she chose didn't want to name him in the lawsuit. But I think he might acknowledge, if I'm remembering correctly, that he at least knew her or had met her.
I don't know. I don't know of that. He did say that he got a massage in Palm Beach, but he said it was an old lady named Olga. Not a young.
Everyone else was busy that day.
Yeah, Berta was busy. But we certainly haven't found anything beyond the witness testimony that would implicate him at all. And I'm sure, like you said, he's going to continue to really adamantly defend himself until the truth is revealed, until we come to a certain agreement on that.